After the end of World War II, the world was split into two, East and West. This marked the beginning of an era called the Cold War. Welcome to the first episode of Metal Girl Solid. My name is Courtney Colson. Yes, I am a woman, I have a deep voice, okay? I get that a lot. There is a pilot, which I do recommend you listen to get an understanding of the structure of the show. But to summarize, this podcast will be reviewing the Metal Gear series and half-hour segments of gameplay per episode. And the following, our opening segment here, is a recap of the events of our first block of minutes. And it will begin with a US military aircraft entering Soviet airspace and ends with Snake spying the first enemy troops of the game. We will learn that they are guarding Sokolov. Our first shot is that of an aircraft. Moving along the exterior from the tail end of the plane to the cockpit, it's here we see our first glimpse of the Fox logo. The text on screen tells us 5:30 AM, August 24, 1964, Pakistani airspace. Yet the dialogue from the pilot tells us that we are about to enter Soviet airspace, effectively conveying the sheer magnitude of the USSR at the time.
Flying over Pakistan, altitude 30,000 feet. Approaching Soviet airspace.
The crew within the cockpit are busy making preparations for the operation about to unfold. Though seen only briefly, we get our first glimpse of Zero/Major Tom/David O, depending on who you ask, as well as the paramedic. Lastly, we are introduced to our protagonist, Naked Snake, who is presently ignoring the officer telling him to extinguish his cigar and put his mask on.
Does this pantywaist know what he's doing?
Snake will only listen when Zero tells him to do so, or maybe he just decided he was good and ready anyway. Snake puts the mask on, and this mask bears some non-diegetic text. Metal Gear Solid Snake Eater.
6 minutes to drop off.
Then we follow Snake as he launches himself out of the plane into supposedly the world's first high-altitude, low-orbit halo jump. Skipping back in time, we listen in on a briefing between Zero and Snake.
The head of the CIA has finally given us the green light for the Virtuous mission.
Virtual mission?
No, the Virtuous mission. The future of our Fox unit depends on it.
We learn that the Virtuous mission is a rescue operation, with the intention of proving Fox's worth to the United States government. The target of this rescue is Nikolai Sokolov, a famous, but fictional, Soviet rocket scientist who participated in the real Vostok rocket project, which allowed the Soviets to reach space before the rest of the world. It was on the 12th of April 1961 on a flight manned by Yuri Gagarin.
The Earth was blue, but there was no God.
Well spoken.
2 years ago, Sokolov requested asylum to the West from one of the CIA's inside agents. His reasoning, Zero presumes, is that he had become afraid of his own creations and so attempted to flee the country with his family. His wife and daughter succeeded, having left first. When it became Sokolov's turn, however, he was not so fortunate. It took the scientist 600 miles and 2 weeks to reach West Berlin. And it's not specified if this was on foot or if he was alone, but the CIA's attention was soon diverted from Sokolov.
And it was only a week later that we had something much bigger on our hands.
The Cuban Missile Crisis.
This nuclear holocaust was briefly avoided when the United States and the Soviet Union were able to make a deal. To the public's knowledge, this was the removal of America's IRBMs, Intermediate Range Ballistic Missiles, from Turkey. These were known as the Jupiter missiles, and these are true events. However, the game proposes that East and West reached a different compromise. The Soviet Union agreed to remove its missiles from Cuba. In exchange, the United States were forced to surrender Sokolov to them. Zero informed Snake that the IRBMs were obsolete and held no strategic value whatsoever. A detail that is potentially true due to the IRBM's notably limited range. Sokolov was of much greater value. He was taken back to the USSR to continue work on a secret project. Zero can only suppose it to be another nuclear weapon. In response, Snake is being sent to the Virgin Cliffs to retrieve Sokolov.
The Virgin Cliffs. Nice name for a virtuous mission.
The mission is assumed to be simple. Grab and go Fulton Sokolov out of there in under 4 hours. But as one can imagine, defying an international treaty is an extremely dangerous and unlawful mission. Snake will be operating entirely alone, procuring resources on site. Cutting back to the present, Snake makes a heroic 3-point landing in the jungle and dramatically unmasks, fully revealing a face that may be familiar. Thus the gameplay begins. Snake immediately radios Zero to give us some initial exposition and tutorial, seamlessly blended into the story. Snake is given his Naked Snake codename, while Zero chooses to go by Major Tom. Snake's first task is to retrieve his backpack out of a tree. In addition to the assistance of Zero, we, the player, are also introduced to the paramedic, who can save our game and advise us on medical treatment and survival. Then there's the boss, Snake's mentor, a woman of great importance to him, but someone he hasn't seen in many years. Snake has clearly missed the boss, having counted the days and minutes since he last saw her. Together they discuss what it means to be a soldier, and on this they clearly have different opinions, a subject that will pervade the entire game. Returning to roaming the jungle, we head towards Dramuchi Swamp, and we encounter our first Gavials. We end just before Snake is about to enter the facility where Sokolov is being held. Ask the Metal Girl. This is our discussion segment. Basically, my experience playing this game for the first time, having played no other Metal Gear game, and also just any real-world stuff I noticed. I've been doing a lot of research. And when I first played this game, I think I was immediately sold on the whole James Bond aspect. I was going through a James Bond phase at the time anyway, and I don't know, I like old stuff. 60s and 80s are generally the eras I'm most drawn to, but this seemed like my vibe, and I liked the weird sense of humor. And yet there is also a strange melancholy that pervades the series. I think that pervades all of Kojima's work. And I'm drawn to that. And I think you see this in a lot of Japanese media as well. Just that diversity of tones. I think in Western media, it tends to be a bit more rigid of this is comedy, this is drama, this is tragedy, this is horror. And sometimes you do get stories that blend the genres, but I think Japan does it, I don't know, in a certain way, in a more effortless way, I don't know. But yeah, I like that there is such a strangeness to this story, but also a tragedy to it. First things first, what does Snake Eater mean? Aside from being the title of a 1980s action film about a Marine, Snake Eater is a term referring to Spec Ops, in particular Green Berets. And these special operatives were a significant part of the Vietnam War, and they operated under SOG, which was a top secret joint unconventional warfare task, to quote Wikipedia here, and that probably has the most in common with Operation Snake Eater. So that is what I was reading a book about SOG. I've done a lot of reading relating to Snake Eater, and yeah, I think SOG and SOG operations are what primarily, if unintentionally, inspired Metal Gear, well, Snake Eater in particular. So the US Army Special Forces worked with a Vietnamese tribe called the Montagnards, French for mountaineers. I hate pronouncing anything in French. And they were a tough people able to survive any conditions. When they displayed their skills for hunting and eating snakes to President Kennedy, the name Snake Eaters was born. At this stage of my initial playthrough, I was focused primarily on the gameplay and figuring out how the controls and the mechanics work. So, I grew up gaming, but 10, 15 years on, you forget what games were like back in 2004. It's the tank, well, it's not quite tank controls, but just how heavy and lethargic it is. Whereas you play, well, before I played Snake Eater, I think I was playing either The Witcher or God of War, or maybe the Arkham Asylum, the Batman Arkham Asylum games, which are very responsive, very quick, very, responsive. You feel so fast and so powerful playing these games. And then you play as Snake in Snake Eater and you go, oh Lord, I'm trying to punch and oh no, the guy's already, 10 meters to my left and I'm... I also wasn't absorbing any of the radio calls and exposition. I mean, I was surprised how dense it was. It was very much, and this game is very front-loaded and just so much to cover in these initial minutes. But I didn't realize that I was supposed to be making radio calls regularly to get information. Well, especially nowadays that we have our phones in our pockets at all times. So I'm playing the game and going, oh, what am I supposed to do? I just Googled it instead of, trying to work things out with the resources you have in front of you, which is what we used to do back in the day and before Steve Jobs ruined our lives forever. Boss is introduced just like any other support character, so her significance really doesn't become apparent until later. Although I did wonder if I was supposed to know the boss, because they seem to be making a big deal out of her. She seemed like such an important and legitimate character, which makes it even more impressive when I learned, no, she was just made for this, but they treat her with such reverence that you believe her legend. Just going back to the radio calls, I totally skipped them. So when I was doing my second playthrough, and I heard Sigint for the first time, I just thought, who the hell is that? I don't know who this is. I think there are some conversations with him that are mandatory. He is mentioned, but I think a majority of them are not essential, so you can just skip them. And so, I don't know, I just did not pay attention. The paramedic was the only one I talked to because you have to when you're saving the game. So I was forced, although it wasn't, a horrible thing, but I was forced to go through all those movie conversations with her, which were enjoyable. It honestly just never occurred to me how significant the radio calls were. I mean, later on when I get to Peace Walker and MGSV, I realized a significant portion of these games are essentially radio plays. And I love that, being that I've been in the podcasting medium for many years. I do love the audio format. And yes, it would be nice if we could have these things visualized, but there's something about the way Metal Gear does it's radio play. It's like a story within a story. I appreciate it now. I get it now. And it is quite a significant part of these games. When it came to understanding the point of the game or the style of the game in terms of stealth and having to avoid conflict, initially I was running and gunning a bit. I was being a bit sneaky, but then I thought I have to go in there and kill them. I was basically approaching this like Batman Arkham Asylum or Arkham City, where, I'm stealthy, drop down, pick the guy up, snap his neck, move on to the next. Whereas, no, in this game, you got to trank, you got to be very quiet. Well, then, I somehow used all of the silencer on my trank gun. I don't know how I did that, and I didn't know how to fix it again. So every time I trank someone, I'd make a noise. I had no idea what I was doing. But the stealth aspect of the game, I quite enjoy. Stealth games are the most enjoyable to me. I like sometimes the more Witcher, God of War style, where I'm Kratos. I'm just smashing my way through every obstacle. I do like that a barbarian approach. But there is something kind of relaxing and yet tense about stealth. I quite enjoyed just taking my time, observing, waiting for the ideal moment. I'm a predator stalking my prey. I quite enjoy that. As for the setting, the 1960s setting, it didn't occur to me that that was strange. I have some peripheral awareness of Metal Gear, the series. I know what Metal Gear Solid 1 looks like. I know Otacon, I know PC's pants, I know Meryl, I know some visuals. I couldn't tell you the plot. Okay, here's my idea of the plot of Metal Gear Solid 1. There's a guy named David, aka Solid Snake. He has a brother, Liquid Snake, which I know from MGSV, and I know Psycho Mantis grows up and is also that as well. And I don't know, I think Liquid Snake and Mantis are buddies or heterosexual life partners or something. I don't know. And was Metal Gear Rex? So Liquid is riding around in Metal Gear Rex, and there's Shadow Moses Island, and it's snowy, and I think Otacon and Solid Snake ride on what do you call those things? The sled, one of those snowmobile things. The Zamboni. I don't know. I'm Australian. I've never seen snow in my life. Although I do plan to go to Japan and stalk Hideo Kojima. No, shh. I said the quiet part out loud. I'm not going to stalk Hideo Kojima, but I am going to Japan in as a ski trip, so we'll see. But anyway, what else happens in Metal Gear Solid 1? There's Old Man, Revolver Ocelot, and I think there's like a torture segment that is quite hard to get through, and that's about everything. Yes, that's my entire knowledge of Metal Gear Solid 1, so I've picked up bits and pieces, just memes really. But it didn't occur to me that, oh, hang on, the Solid Snake games are all in like a futuristic cyberpunk kind of setting, but Snake Eater is in the 1960s, and it never occurred to me that, well, so who is Naked Snake and who is Solid Snake? I didn't even have that kind of reasoning of, I think maybe I thought, oh, is Big Boss the father of Solid Snake? That was all I could really suppose. That is basically it. And yeah, I mean, the naming of these games, Metal Gear Solid 3. So I know it's a prequel, but because there was such an overwhelming amount of information, and I think if you throw anyone into a story like this with no preparation, and I can see that now having played a few games after that, you just kind of zone out, and your focus narrows down to the task in front of you. So, well, Snake, you seem to have left your backpack up in that tree. Now press these buttons, climb up there, and get back to the fucking mission. Yes, sir. Like, I don't know where all this is going yet. But it is interesting to note that Operation Snake Eater begins in 1964, so that's 60 years ago now. That's August. And then Snake Eater the game just had its anniversary. And then Snake Eater the game was released in 2004, so that's its 20th anniversary. So one's August and the release date was November. So it's all very close, and I don't know if that was intentional, releasing it around that same time, or they just picked those numbers at random. I don't know. So Major Tom does mention, I've given you this code name, Naked Snake. Oh, what does that mean? Well, he says, I'll explain later. He doesn't really, but essentially it's just, well, you're naked and you have to slither along the ground. And I think Snake, Snake, the name obviously comes from Snake Plissken from Escape from New York, and the appearance of this character is obviously based on that as well. But I was reading the SOG book, and they do mention snakes. I kind of pick up on every little reference to snakes around me, having been doing this research for so long. But I'll just read a bit from SOG here. But before the Air Force helicopters could reach Stockdale, with daylight just cutting through the morning mist, the hidden Green Beret detected two NVA, North Vietnamese Army, walking back and forth across the burned field. Then they froze, pointed to the ground, and shouted excitedly. They'd found his snake-like trail, where he'd crawled through the ashes the night before, and now they were pointing directly to where he lay hidden. And I'm wondering if that sort of stuff inspired Kojima as well. I don't know if he's read these sorts of things, but Yeah, he says the name Solid Snake is snake, snaking along, crawling along the ground. So, I don't know, is it just sort of, well, naturally you would make that equivalence, no matter who you are? I don't know, but it's interesting to note. To address some other features of this block of minutes, so the halo jump. So the origins of the halo technique date back to 1951 during the Korean War. And who else would be behind it but John Kirk Singlaub, who was a major general in the United States Army. He was a founding member of the CIA, and he was a highly decorated officer in the OSS, which is basically the predecessor to the CIA. This man was a beast, and he is a significant part of the Vietnam War as well. And I do recommend that SOG book by John L. Plaster, SOG, Secret Wars of America's Commandos in Vietnam. After this, Singlaub conducted a series of proof-of-concept test jumps using an L-19 Bird Dog, and made a series of high-altitude, low-opening test jumps over the Han River in Korea. So, Singlaub, unsurprisingly, was the first guy to do this. That does not surprise me at all. He beat Snake to the punch by maybe a decade, although I think it would be another decade or two before it became a regular feature of combat situations. I would really love to go into more depth about the conversation between the boss and Snake, because it is fantastic and so layered. But we do not have time in this episode, so I'm going to do it in the next one. And also I want to note the music is by Harry Gregson Williams, which surprised me. When I was seeing the credits, I thought, oh, like a real proper like movie guy. All right, interesting. Although getting to know Kojima a bit better now, that makes perfect sense. He wants as much movie-esque qualities in his game as possible. And Kojima's quite an interesting guy because he's so in love with films. 90% of his DNA is movies, as he says, and he hasn't really played video games in a long time. When he's been interviewed about his favorite video games, he mentions stuff from decades and decades ago. He'll mention something new every once in a while, but you look at his social media, it's all just movies. He consumes movies constantly, and he's using video game. I don't know how he got into that. We'll get into Kojima's backstory another episode, but for someone who loves film, he never ventured into making films. He wanted to make video games back in a time when video games had nothing cinematic and had very limited means of storytelling. It was basically cave painting. And also I did know the Metal Gear theme song, although it's not quite the same in Snake here, I'm pretty sure. Simulacra and Simulation. Now, this segment is basically where we explore the lines between fact and fiction within the Metal Gear games, lines that Kojima often blurs masterfully. I mean, just in the introduction of this game, I had to point out this was fictional, this is real, this is fiction. The title of this segment comes from the book of the same name by French semiotician and social theorist Jean Baudrillard. I hate saying French words. Though this concept, as well as all philosophical concepts, can trace its origins back to Plato himself, he's kind of the grandfather of philosophy. I don't know if you're aware. You might have heard of him. For the sake of simplicity and for our sanity, I'll briefly summarize these concepts. You're all lucky I studied semiotics as part of my librarianship degree. So Simulacra and Simulation, the book, was a slog, by the way, let me tell you. The most simple way of breaking this down is into the modernist and postmodernist views of reality. And I argue that this is crucial in understanding Metal Gear to its fullest anyway, so bear with me. Modernism is a philosophical movement of rationalism and empiricism. Modernism originates in the 17th century, and it holds the view that there are universal truths. The universe is a logical place, and that man has only to move beyond his beliefs to perceive the truth. But what is the truth? Who decides upon it? Is it through consensus? Is it through science or mathematics? Well, postmodern philosophy, which arose in the mid-20th century, is its very opposite, suggesting that there can be no truth at all. All we have are the signifiers and the signifying. This is to say that when we look at the signs, symbols, and objects around us, the signifiers, we are doomed to always project our biases and meaning onto them, the signified. As Umberto Eco, another noted semiotician, said, if signs can be used to tell the truth, they can also be used to lie. Modernist and postmodernist philosophy applies to media analysis as well, which is relevant to us, of course. One could say the modernist interpretation of art told people what to think, whilst postmodernism taught people how to think. With that foundation in place, and I know it's a lot, what is a simulation and what is a simulacra? According to Plato, there are two kinds of image making. The first is a faithful reproduction, attempting to copy precisely the original. The second is intentionally distorted in order to make the copy appear correct to viewers. He gives the example of Greek pillars, which were crafted larger at the top than they were at the bottom, so that viewers on the ground would see them as proportionate. If they were to view them to scale, they would realize it was malformed. Baudrillard, who had 4 versions of reality, but we're not even going to get into that, took this concept of simulacrum further. When the copy becomes more than the reality, it replaces it. It becomes hyperreality. And we see this in our daily lives, in advertisement, in fashion, in pornography. We have an ideal of natural and right and normal, when in truth it is a hyperreality that we have constructed as a species together at a fairly recent point in history. To a number of fans that I saw online, it seems evident that Kojima is aware of Baudrillard's work. It permeates the entire series of Metal Gear games. It may be the reason that these stories are so incredibly dense and confusing, because there are no truths. There are no heroes or villains. This isn't East versus West, even if it seems so on the surface. There are no facts, only interpretations, to quote Nietzsche. Kojima isn't telling us what to think, but rather how to think. Metal Gear is a postmodernist deconstruction of the military hero, the American exceptionalist power fantasy. Metal Gear shows how bitter and hollow that fantasy really is at its core. For more on this, Zoran Ivanovici, I think is how you say it, of GameStop back in 2010 wrote a fantastic article on Metal Gear and hyperreality, which will be included in the citations. From my limited perspective, it seems that this motif comes to a crescendo in MGS-V, where the very concepts of truth and reality are thoroughly dismantled. Here in Snake Eater, we have perhaps one of the most significant real-world examples of deception and false narratives ever seen in the global theater, the Cold War. Alright, so you're following? Are you following? Okay. Now, I will point out some cases of simulation and simulacrum in this block. So my choice for the simulacrum of this episode is the Earth is blue and there is no God. This isn't what Yuri Gagarin said. It is possibly propaganda by Khrushchev, and I was amazed to discover this when I started digging into it. So some Soviet sources have said that Gagarin commented during his spaceflight, "I don't see any God up here." Reading from a website called Interfax Religion here, some Soviet sources have said that Gagarin commented during his spaceflight, "I don't see any God up here," though no such words appear in the verbatim records of his conversations with Earth stations during the spaceflight. In a 2006 interview, Gagarin's friend Colonel Valentin Petrov stated that Gagarin never said these words and that the quote originated from Khrushchev's speech at the plenum of the Central Committee of the CPSU about the state's anti-religion campaign, saying Gagarin flew into space but he didn't see any God there. Petrov also said Gagarin had been baptized in the Russian Orthodox Church as a child, and a 2011 FOMA interview quoted the rector of the Orthodox Church in Star City saying Gagarin baptized his eldest daughter, Yelena, shortly before his spaceflight, and his family used to celebrate Christmas and Easter and kept icons in the house. However, in his book, Gagarin denied God and wrote, "Man's flight into space dealt a crushing blow to the churchmen. In the streams of letters coming to me, I was pleased to read the confessions in which believers, impressed by the achievements of science, renounced God, agreed that there is no God, and everything connected with his name is fiction and nonsense." So that's wow, what a rabbit hole. I guess we'll never know the truth. We know he didn't say that. But as for his, Gagarin's, personal religious perspective, well, it seems he may have become an atheist after his mission to space. We'll never know. But based on the evidence, that's what I would conclude. And that's how we have to approach this game from now on, not this is what it says and this is what it means. It's all conjecture. And I've spent a lot of time with the Metal Gear community on Reddit, but avoiding spoilers. Somehow I've amazingly avoided spoilers. I think because a lot of the fans now are coming into this the same way I am, actually. They're playing a lot of these more recent games, so they actually aren't playing the Solid Snake games, well, especially 4, which is locked within the PS3, so it's even more difficult to access. So a lot of us are playing MGSV or maybe Peace Walker. Now you're seeing a little bit more variety because of the games being finally brought to PC. But for the longest time, it really was just MGSV that people were familiar with. But it is fascinating to watch this community argue some things. You know, they swear black and blue. No, this is what happened, and it was vocal cord parasites, or it was nano machines, and it is trying to approach Metal Gear in a way that has a very solid foundation of logic and reality, and I think that's the absolute wrong way. Why so many people readily accepted this false quote from Yuri is that it seems to make sense. It fulfills our expectation. What's America's first words on the moon? One small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind. Oh, optimistic, exceptionalist. Yeah, yes, perfect. And then what do the Russians say? There is no God. Yeah, makes sense. That checks out. That's what I would expect Russians to do. And my choice of simulation in this episode is the Survival Viewer. This is a feature in which the game attempts to simulate the experience of being a soldier conducting this kind of mission. It goes into the minutiae of eating and self-administered medical treatment. Snake is highly capable, but he's not indestructible. And these are carefully made choices a game developer makes. These limitations serve to ground Snake in reality. You are forced to consider the logistics of the scenario as if it were real. The Piggyback Game Guide. I love strategy guidebooks for some reason, especially for a game like Metal Gear. Finally, all the secrets are laid bare, and there are a lot of secrets. I'm still learning more despite having played Snake Eater in its entirety 3 times now. In this section, we are covering all those little details you might not know about. It is worth mentioning that there was another published by Brady Games, and I draw the line at reading 2 and comparing them on the podcast. That's kind of going too far. But I like the humor of the Piggyback one, and also they ended up doing a strategy guide for MGSV, so I kind of want to just keep it consistent in that sense. So here's a quote about the first choice you're presented with in the game. Your choice won't have any bearing on the game whatsoever. However, if you stubbornly insist on selecting I like MGS2, the game will start with an in-joke for people who have played Metal Gear Solid 3's predecessor. You begin the game wearing the Rykov mask. After a while, Zero will tell Snake to take it off. Obviously, I didn't do that, although my former co-host mentioned that when he was a kid playing this game, and you've asked me if you like Metal Gear Solid 2. I like Metal Gear Solid 2, so he selected that. You start the game as Raiden. Well, he thought he was playing as Raiden, and he was so confused, and he was like, this is so shit. Why am I Raiden? He went on a forum and asked about it, and then everyone commented, yeah, kid, just wait a few more minutes, you idiot. It still happens to this day, though. I still see people on Reddit saying, I've just started playing the, remastered Snake Eater. Why am I Raiden? And I don't understand why Raiden is so hated. I don't know anything about him. I know he becomes a robot man, and that is it. Now, I've played this game thrice now, and I only just learned now that I can dive, having read this book. I thought it was an MGSV thing, but it's just walk and X. And also, Snake can stand on tiptoe in first-person view, which is R1, R2, plus L2. That's new to me. Now, this is one I know, but I like the way it's described here. Time paradox. The Snake is dead text slowly changes into the words time paradox. Why? It's simple. As Metal Gear Solid 3 takes place in the past, before the events of the previous Metal Gear games, it's firmly established that Snake survived this mission. Because if he didn't, the world we know today, not to mention Snake's eventual progeny, could not exist. Your role is to recreate the events that have, effectively, already occurred. You see? Elementary causality. Destroying the radio. Without a radio, Snake's enemies can't call for reinforcements. One well-aimed hit can destroy these chest-mounted devices. Bear in mind that not every soldier carries a radio. I didn't know that. I never tried to shoot the radio, although the controls are not precise or sensitive enough, because there's another example where if you want to do chokehold, it is just the slightest difference between that and snapping their neck. So I just didn't try. I just went along and just used the easy gun on everyone. Oh, the slides during the radio call. So during these exchanges, you'll see a picture of your conversational partner, your interlocutor, if you want to know. That's a new word for you guys, interlocutor. Your conversation partner in the upper left corner of the screen. Beneath it are numbers, for example, 2 of 4. This indicates that of 4 available pictures, you are currently viewing the second. Press the left stick to the left or right to switch between snapshots. I did not know that. I have played this game 3 times and it never fucking occurred to me, because when it came to the radio calls, I put my controller down, closed my eyes, and focused very intently on what they're saying. And yeah, no, unless it automatically switches the image, I will not do that. I did not know that was a choice. I think that shows that, well, even though I am a 90s kid, I grew up with these games where we had to use our own frickin' brains and explore and trial and error. And modern games have taught me that they've just held my hand so much that you just forget. You just assume, well, if there was something to do here, it would tell me, right? All of these days I'm playing Baldur's Gate 3, so I'm quickly learning, no, it is just this massive open world game and you can probably fuck with everything. Go ahead, try, see what happens. Something usually happens in that game. The Japanese novelization. You might not be aware, but there are novelizations of the Metal Gear Solid games, or most of them. And I've read all 3 of the prequels, so Snake Eater, Peace Walker, Phantom Pain. And I own them, and the reason you may not be aware of them is that they are in Japanese and have never been translated, although Peace Walker and MGSV do have fan translations. I, having learned Japanese for about 5 years, I am translating them myself, obviously using Google Translate to do the bulk of the work, but then I can get down into the nitty-gritty and go, no, you didn't mean that. That kanji could mean that, but in this context, I know it means something else. So it was Hitori Nojima who wrote Peace Walker and Phantom Pain, which I liked, as well as Metal Gear Solid 2, which I haven't read, of course. Now, Hitori means alone, so I don't even know if that's his name. I mean, it's one of those things where the kanji reads one way as a word, and then you pronounce it a totally different way as a name. And we will delve into that further when the blue-eyed samurai himself, Kazuhiro Miller, shows up. Toshi Hase wrote Snake Eater. And initially I didn't like it as much as the other 2, but as I've gone further into the Snake Eater novelization, I might say it's the better of the 3 because it really expands upon what we're given in the game. Each of the Cobra unit gets a more thorough backstory, so it is very rewarding. And as we shall do here, I will read it for you. This novelization opens with a fairly brutal prologue of the Russian soldiers experiencing a nuclear blast and their slow resultant deaths. The opening of the game is identical in the book, although it's the wording in Japanese that I find most fascinating, being that I am so familiar with how this dialogue is supposed to sound in English. Now, given that we cover 30 minutes of gameplay per episode, we will cover 30 pages of the novelization per episode, although this episode will go a little beyond that. Here on page 32, the Japanese term for snake, hebi, and the anglicized snakeku are used interchangeably. For example, Zero says, "That's right, the legendary unit assembled by the boss during World War II was also a snake, the Cobra unit." And in Japanese, that would be, "Sodatomo, Dainiji Taisenchu, Zabasu ga hensai shita densetsu no butai mo hebi data, Cobra butai." Best Japanese accent there, hopefully I got it right. And later, the boss says, "Snake. Yes, it was a snake. Appropriate code name." And in Japanese, "Hebi, so, suneku datta wa ne, fusa wa shikodo nemu." So, I'm not sure why they choose when to say snake and when to say hebi, but there it is, and it happens throughout the book. While we do see a backpack in this part of the game, you never physically see it again. It is mentioned in the novelization many times, so perhaps they were initially envisioning Snake to have a visible backpack. I mean, I'm a fan of backpacks, so I wouldn't have minded, but instead they've just kind of gone for this implied backpack situation. Here's some other interesting bits. His, Snake's, overachieving, well-trained body is wrapped in a field uniform for descent. He is a white guy with brown hair and blue eyes who could have a romantic appearance if he was in a different place, but he has a rough impression that stands out. Although he was young, not even in his 30s, he was surrounded by veterans and seemed to be the most calm. And I like that. Well, see, it is describing his appearance very bluntly. There's no other way I could have interpreted that, which is, it is white, man, brown hair, blue eyes. There's nothing, not a romantic description of him, although they did say he could have a romantic appearance. I like that description of him. Also, it freaks me out that I am now older than Big Boss, or at least, in Snake Eater, I'm older than Naked Snake in Snake Eater. Because I'm 32 as I'm recording this, and he was 29, and he will be 29 forever. Let's get a little existential there. This book also wants to be very specific that he isn't quite 190 centimeters / 6'2" for some reason. I don't know why height is something that always seems to be specified in games. Blood type's another one, I think, and especially in Japanese games. Snake's halo jump plays out the same in terms of action, but there's absolutely no dialogue, so we lose a lot of that exposition. Zero is described as an elderly man with slicked back grey hair. There is a shallow knife wound running vertically through his left arm and up to his face. This is an old injury he received during World War II. Major David O, an elderly man, spoke carefully. "Jack, we have permission for the Virtuous mission. We have permission for the Virtuous mission." So now we know where he got that scar, we could have assumed. But we didn't know that the scar actually goes all the way up. So it starts on his arm and then works its way up to his face. I don't think we ever see Zero's exposed arm, so yeah, this is a bit of trivia that we would never have known otherwise. The paramedic is described as a young woman. She was an intelligent beauty with dark brown hair. So just the most bare bones description ever. No creativity. Look, there is some creativity later on. It's just not here yet. Although, to be fair, there was that whole opening with the Russian soldiers and being nuked and surviving that and the horror of that. And I find that's quite common with novelization. So I used to do a podcast, which might still be around something, but it was called The Book Was Better. And we would read movie novelizations and review them. And a lot of them, it's a very weird industry, but it's still going. People still do novelizations. And no one's really editing. No one's really paying attention to what these people write. But I do notice a lot of them had these opening chapters that were quite adventurous. They had so much creativity. They had so much energy. They've come to work their first day, bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, so inspired. And then, as the novelization goes on, it's just there are glaring grammatical problems. But yeah. all of them, or most of them, had a creative take on where the story should begin. That's a little different from the movie most of the time. Now, back to Snake. All he brought with him was a non-US military uniform chosen for the jungle, a backpack stuck in a tree, and a knife. Is it non-US? I mean, in the next episode, I'll talk more about the uniforms. I do have a Naked Snake costume that is basically 90%, 95% accurate at this point. And it was fun to assemble all of that. But yeah, what would make it non-US? It just meaning it doesn't have the American patches on it, because those uniforms are basically identical world over. And civilians use them for hunting or sport or camping, any kind of outdoor stuff. And here's a bit I find quite beautiful. Green leaves were falling like rain, the scent of a dense forest full of life, wrapped in it. The presence of the forest felt warm and welcoming. The sweat on his face now cooled, exposed to the outside air. It was refreshing. He looked up to the sky, and then came to his senses and hid behind the thick tree nearby. So there are nice little poetic moments here and there, and I'll be sure to share them. And the boss is described like this, at least her voice. She has a deep, dignified, but strict voice. And later on we'll get a description of her appearance, which it's a good one actually, so look forward to that. Something that occurs to me about the whole Virtuous Mission, Virgin Cliffs wordplay is that you would have to be a native English speaker to understand that, and I'm wondering who came up with that wordplay, because I'm assuming in Japanese there is no equivalence between the words for virtuous and virgin. So virtuous would be toku no takai, and then virgin is shoujo, which is the shoujo genre of anime and manga is aimed specifically at young women, young girls, which is funny. So shonen for young boys doesn't mean virgin, but shoujo. So, I don't know, only girls can be virgins, I don't know. So, in order to make that virtuous virgin equivalent, someone had to have an understanding of English to that degree. I don't know. When Kojima was writing this story, how does that come about? I'd love to know. But that's fairly sophisticated wordplay. So those are my favorite bits I found in this segment of the book. And I'm really trying to do my best to translate in a way that's not too literal, but not taking too many liberties either. I really want to capture what the intended message must have been. And I'm not a native speaker, so if anyone is a native speaker out there, feel free to correct me. And with that, we reach the end of the first episode of Metal Gear Solid Season 1, Snake Eater. I hope you join me for the rest of the series, and you can find the citations in the description below, and I might put those citations on social media as well, maybe Twitter/X or Instagram, where you can see these things and see links to them. So with that, over and out.